welcome everybody to our Facebook Live today. Please do chip in and add your comments and questions if you have any. Today we're talking about where to start with any disputes. So that's disputes in the workplace, employee disputes between employees and companies. And we get a lot of questions around this because a lot of people find it quite overwhelming. So Rihanna, you're the expert in this area. If I was an employee, where do I start with a grievance process?
So before I answer that question for you, Alison, let me just say that ultimately I look at it from an HR perspective, and it could be that at times people would have to get specialist information on this as well. So I would also advise, yes, speak to an HR person, but the moment it starts becoming tricky and the moment it starts becoming complicated, that's when you need to go and speak to an employment lawyer.
Okay. That's cool.
But in terms of grievances, the question that you asked me now, that's something that any HR person will be able to assist with.
Okay.
So if you look at from a grievance point of view, that's when an employee has an issue with someone in the organization, or it could be with their manager.
So maybe I can just step back and ask a different question then. What is the difference between a grievance and a dispute?
So a grievance would be in terms of, I would almost say it's a next level to a dispute. A dispute would just be in terms of where it's a disagreement.
Okay.
From that perspective, and you and I can sit down and we can reach, let's say, an agreement to agree to disagree.
Okay.
From that perspective. A dispute is, a grievance is almost a level further than that, in that I am not happy with what we agreed, and I think whatever the disagreement was is something that's much more serious. And so therefore I want to go ahead and put in a grievance. So it could be, for example, you thought something was a banter, but I took offense to it, and so therefore I want to take a step forward and go to our manager and tell our manager, I'm not happy with what Alison said. This is what she said. I told her that's unacceptable, and please do not make jokes like that in the office anymore. But you still continued with the process.
Sure.
And that's when I feel, okay, now I want to put in a grievance.
And as an employee, where would I know where to find that grievance process that I need to follow? Where would the information be?
Okay, so once you start with an organization or any company, then it's part of your onboarding process.
Yep.
Where you would get an employee handbook, or what some companies know as an employee manual.
Okay.
And if you don't have that, then go to your HR department and ask them for a copy of the employee handbook. In there, it will give you the guidance in terms of, if there's a grievance, what process do I follow? And who do I go to if there's a grievance? Because there are certain steps that you have to follow. So, for example, if the grievance was between yourself and myself, I would go to my manager and say, I want to start a grievance process. I would say what the grievance was, when it happened, etc. And then they would need to investigate that grievance.
Okay.
It could be that they have a discussion with you to get then your feedback.
Sure.
And then look at in terms of, can they mediate between the two of us?
Okay.
If not, if the transgression is considered to be of such a nature that it needs to go to disciplinary because it goes against the values of the company, for example,
Sure.
then they can go on to the next step, which would then be a disciplinary.
Okay.
From that perspective. But I always tell all employees, try and sit down with the individual and see if you could resolve the issue first before taking it to the next stage of a grievance. It's not always possible within an organization. It is such that sometimes that transgression is of a nature where unfortunately you have to lodge a grievance, and it is uncomfortable, and I know it is stressful. Some people just have thought of, I have to go out and lodge a grievance, because then you think about the relationship going forward, and how will that relationship with the individual be as well going forward.
Sure.
And it creates, I know, uneasiness within the team that you're working within as well.
Yeah.
Because people then sit and think, oh, do I take sides? And no, it's not a matter of taking sides. It's what's right and what's wrong, and what's company values, and what does our employee handbook say about these type of behaviors from that perspective. Another example is, let's say, for example, you had a grievance with our manager.
Okay.
Again, you'll try and sit down and resolve. My advice would be try and resolve it with our manager. If it cannot be resolved, then you'd have to go to their manager and then lodge the grievance with them, and they'll go through the same steps that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Now, within small businesses, that's always not possible. So to give an example, with one of the clients I've worked with previously, they were a very small business. So if there was a grievance against a manager, the next level would be the CEO.
Right.
However, there are certain steps in place. Now, to say, if the grievance was investigated, and let's say the person that lodged the grievance was unhappy with the outcome of the grievance, then they would take it to the next level, which would then go to the CEO, and then he or she would then have to look at it.
Yeah.
And then make a decision. If the company is very small, that's very difficult.
Yeah.
And that's when it's sometimes important to say, okay, we're small, we possibly don't have an in-house HR person, but we do have a company we can refer to. Then go to them, and they can be your independent person to come in and look at the dispute and see if they can resolve it. So I advised actually an employee who worked for a very small company, and the company didn't have an HR person at all. And she had a grievance against her manager, who was also the CEO of the company, which then makes it quite difficult.
Goodness, yes.
Yeah. So she had to tell her manager that she's lodging a grievance, and then they had to lodge that with the HR outsourced company.
Okay.
And then they sent in an individual to come and investigate both parties and then give an outcome.
Okay. And we're going to look at the employer side of things later, but sticking with the employee side of things at the moment, if you feel that there's not enough information within the company itself, if you feel that you need some extra guidance and help about how to take this forwards, what sort of places can they go to? Where can they find information, or who can they turn to for help?
Okay, so my go-to, and I call it my Bible, and I think for all HR people, or even line managers even, and employees, there's a good website, ACAS, ACAS, and we can put the links up for people to see where they
we'll
can
do
get
that in the comments after the go live, so that'll be great for help.
With ACAS, both for an employee and employer perspective, they give guidelines in terms of what you can do in each instance.
Okay.
And I think what's really good about it is that, for example, when I write employee handbooks, I'll always refer to ACAS guidelines and make sure that the employee handbook is in line with the guidelines set out by ACAS, because then you do know that you are following a process that should it go to tribunal, they are going to look at what did you do, and you can always refer back to you went to the ACAS guidelines.
So who are ACAS? What makes them an authority in this?
So they an institution that's been set up to advise all employers and employees.
Okay.
And basically from the government side, because it's .gov.uk, if we look at it from that perspective. The other thing as well is the Citizens Advice
Mm-hmm.
Bureau,
Yeah.
they also able to give advice on certain aspects, not on everything,
Okay.
but on certain aspects, and very few people know about that. But you can also go to them, and they've got a section on their website, I think it's called Work,
Yeah.
and you can see what the advice they can help you with. Something I forgot to mention about ACAS is that they've got a helpline that you can call into.
Okay.
And
so that's really helpful.
You can remain anonymous as
Okay.
well. So you can give them the scenario and what the context of the situation is,
Yeah.
and they will advise you based on the information that you've provided.
Okay, that's helpful.
But again, as I said, if things start becoming complicated or tricky, I would advise go and speak to an employment lawyer.
Okay. And they're always external to the company, aren't they? They're independent employment lawyers.
Yes. Especially if you're an employee and you're not sure exactly of what your rights are and you need the guidance,
Sure.
then an employment lawyer, I think, would be the best person to refer your case to.
Okay.
Because with bigger companies, they've got an employment law department.
Sure.
And so they've got people they can refer to within the company to help with their disputes and that.
Mm-hmm.
But as an employee, you're on your own.
Yeah.
And sometimes employees say, but if I go to the internal employment lawyer, they're still thinking with a hat on in terms of the employer.
Of course.
And not always the case, because they've also got to be objective
Of course.
and see whether the employer, in this case, was in the wrong and advise what needs to be done. But if you feel you want a more objective person, there are employment lawyers that you can go and discuss your case with. If I remember, we are actually interviewing somebody over the next couple of weeks,
Mm-hmm.
and he would be an example of an employment lawyer
Okay.
you'd go and speak to.
Yeah. And of course, this is only after you've tried to resolve it first,
Yes.
rather than jumping straight into the employment lawyer scenario. So you're not wanting to make something antagonistic. This is really if everything else fails and you've had all the discussions internally and you really feel that you're not getting the support and the traction that you expected, then this is the next step, to take it external to the company.
My advice is always see if you can resolve the issue with a person involved first.
Okay.
If it can't, then yes, go the disciplinary route.
Okay.
And then see what the outcome is. If you're happy with the outcome, fine and well. If not, your company will set out the steps involved in terms of who the next person is, in terms of who you can lodge your complaint with.
Mm-hmm.
And then they will take it further from there. But always refer back to your employee handbook.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot really think, oh, I'm just going to skip steps. Now, you can't, if I've got a dispute with you and I want to put in a grievance, yes, I suppose I can jump to the line manager above our line manager, but protocol is really go to our line manager and lodge it with them, because they know both of us. They would probably have some context in terms of what we're talking about as well.
But of course this is dependent on the size of the company.
Dependent on the size of the company. And then if you know the company's got an outsourced HR company that helps them, nothing stops you from going to speak to the outsourced HR company as well.
And of course this is all based on companies and employees being in the UK.
Yes.
If you have any questions about where to go if you're outside the UK, if you're dropping in to listen to this video, please do put a comment in the bottom. And we have different resources that we can turn to find out the right place for you to go to if you're in a different country.
Yes. So I've got contacts in different countries as well, which I would be able to refer people to. If I don't have a contact in that company, we can find one for you or refer you to a website that you can go to.
Excellent. Yeah. Cool.
So that's the grievance. It's a minefield. I think employment legislation and employment law is a minefield out there.
And it's changing all the time.
Yeah, and it's never black and white as much as we'd like it to be. Would make life so much more easier.
So anything else to add on the employee side before we jump to the employer side?
I think for an employee side, it is quite stressful. It is stressful from the point of view, as I mentioned earlier. You wonder whether you should lodge the grievance. If you feel really unhappy about something and it is making your life difficult at work, then yes, go ahead and lodge the grievance, because it's not going to go away. And you're going to land up feeling disgruntled, feeling unhappy, feeling this is not a workspace you want to come into, and then wanting to leave the organization. And I do understand it's not that easy, because you think about the team around you as well.
Sure.
So if you need to go and speak to someone else about it, and I'm talking more from a well-being side, and I'm going to ask you then the question with regard to this, Alison, is for an employee from a well-being perspective, it's very stressful for them.
Absolutely.
Some of them even land up taking a sick day off. Just the thought of having to go put in a grievance.
Yeah. And I know you've had to deal with that recently, haven't you? You've had to deal, I mean, let's just go to your story first before I talk about it from a well-being perspective.
Let me give you an example of what I went through. So mine wasn't so much a grievance. It was an employee I was interviewing as a witness to a disciplinary investigation.
Okay.
But having said that, it was stressful on this employee as well as the other employees that I was interviewing.
Of course.
But specifically stressful for this one employee, that it was mentioned to me that they took a sick day the day before. And they weren't even sure whether they were going to attend the disciplinary interview, even though they know it was not against them, but the fact that they were being interviewed for evidence against the person whom the decision was being made whether there should be a disciplinary hearing or not. And in that session, I couldn't start the interview immediately. I had to first sit down and listen to the person, make sure that they wanted to be there, make sure that they were willing to give evidence if it was going to be required. But also, I had to make sure that the person felt comfortable, and I had to tell them at that stage I would keep their details anonymous in terms of their personal details. However, I did have to highlight, should the decision be that the case has to go to a disciplinary hearing, then all parties need to get the information, which does then mean their personal details will have to be revealed. And that will be discussed with them at that moment in time.
Could they have declined to be a witness? They could have. So they could have declined.
Yes.
But they decided to go ahead, even though it was stressful.
Exactly. So I could see that person was stressed. What advice could I have given them besides sitting there and going through the process?
Absolutely. And this sort of process is difficult for everybody. It's difficult for the employee. It's difficult for those around them that maybe have to give witnesses and give information. It's difficult for the rest of the team. It causes a lot of stress, and it's difficult for the employer as well. It's not a nice thing to have to do. So it's really, really important that you take care of yourself, that you make sure that you've got a good support network. Speaking to friends and family can be helpful, although obviously depending on what part of the process you're at, you have to be careful about what information you share with people. If you're the employee that's going through the process, then they're probably also upset and stressed along with you. So sometimes it can be a bit counterproductive to talk to friends and family. So other things to do is go and talk to your GP, who can give you a referral to a professional service of somebody that you can talk to. There's lots of different organisations out there like Mind, the mental health charity, that will help you. We're not saying that you've got a mental health problem, but they're really great at helping you through stressful situations and giving you advice. There's other local support centres. We already talked about Citizens Advice. And also we've talked about self-care in other videos about what to do when. So have a look at our other videos as well, where we're talking about simple exercises you can do to calm yourself down. We've talked about the importance of health and nutrition. All of these things really matter when you're stressed. So it's taking the time to look after yourself and doing what you need to do. And if you can't find what you're looking for on our website, again, just post in the comments and we'll do our best to help you, advise you, refer you to somebody that can give you more advice.
Something just triggered me and I've just wrote it down. So the other thing as well is find out by your HR department if there's an employee assistance program in place within the company. Because within the employee assistance program, it could be via that avenue. You could call them and get advice. And I know with some of them as well, it's dealt with anonymously.
I think all of them anonymous.
Yes.
So it's all anonymous. They don't give information back to your employer.
Okay. So I would advise you to do that as well. There are people out there that you can speak to. And try and make it as less stressful as you can for yourself. Again, we are there as well if you want to use us as a sounding board.
Absolutely.
But I think, yes, as an employee, you need all the support that you can get within an organization, because sometimes you feel you're on your own and nobody is there batting your corner.
Absolutely. The only thing to mention with employee assistance programs is that not all employers have them.
Exactly.
So you would have to find out whether your particular organisation has an employee assistance program, often referred to as EAP.
Yes.
So you would have to ask. It should be referred to in the HR policy or manual as well about who's providing that service, if it is a service that the company have available. So that's a good one, Rihanna.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else from your side you want to find out?
I think we've pretty much covered it from the employee perspective. So it's equally a minefield from the employer perspective, isn't it?
Yes.
I think probably the first thing that comes to mind from an employer perspective is, what about probation? Because you take staff on and you have a probation period before you actually have them as full employees. What about if all of this happens during probation? Is it a different process? Is it the same? How does that work?
So it depends in terms of what the issue is during the probation period. So let's say when somebody starts with an organization, I always tell the line manager, sit down and clearly define what the objectives are that the person needs to deliver. So they know that if their probation period, let's say, is 3 months or 6 months, they know what the outputs they're being measured on within the 3 months or 6 months, if it's going to be a performance issue. From that perspective. And have regular meetings with them as well, so that they also know how they're progressing, so that by the end of the probation period, it doesn't come to them as a surprise that you're not continuing with the probation. But there are other things that can come up in that you thought within the interview it looked like the person was going to be a culture fit. And the person's now in the organization, and after a couple of months, you see it's not working out. They're not gelling with the team. There's a clash with the values within the organization. Now, as an employer, and what most people don't know, and this is from an employee perspective side as well as an employer perspective side, that with the employment law, you can dismiss someone under 24 months, so under 2 years of service.
Okay.
Except for if it's discrimination,
of course,
they will have employment rights.
Yeah.
But within that 2 years, they don't really have employment rights.
Okay.
However, for me, and this is controversial, this is my personal opinion.
Sure.
I think that's an easy way out for a lot of employers. I would normally advise, if you think there's an issue around culture fit, or the person's not gelling well with the team, or there's a clash with values, whatever the issue is, again, follow the same process you would have followed as if the person was an employee longer than 2 years within the organization.
Sure.
See how you can resolve it to give a person a fair chance.
Yeah.
And then only if you see if it's not going to work out, then say, we've tried to resolve this. It's not working. You're still within your probation period, and so therefore it's best that we part ways. You go your way, we go our way, and we release you from the organization. Now, I can actually share a couple of examples that I've had. So one was for a client where we appointed someone. Interview process was really good. References that we got was good as well.
Yeah.
And the interview process the person went through was, I think, 3 or 4 stages of interviews. And then out of the blue, the CEO got a call from a client that this person used to work for as well.
Okay.
And then said, I heard you appointed this individual. Do you really know the full reason as to why he's left the organization that he's worked for? And it came out to a different story to what we were told.
Oh, okay.
And in the references, they didn't give us the full feedback.
But then they wouldn't have been allowed to, would they?
No, unless... So again, the reference is a very contentious issue. If you know people quite well, they will indirectly give you information for you to help you to make a decision.
Sure.
But if they don't know you, they won't give that information. In this case, we did know the people from whom we were getting the references from.
Okay.
But they didn't highlight anything because they felt sorry for the individual and thought he needed another chance.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that went against the values of the company.
Mm-hmm.
Reason being that honesty for the position he was being appointed in is critical.
Absolutely.
And if clients felt that they were being lied to, then that's it. They wouldn't want to do business with him.
Sure.
They wouldn't give him business, which meant it would have an impact on the company's revenue.
Mm-hmm.
But also the fact that he lied during the interview process, even though it was directly put to him the reason why he left his last employer.
Okay.
So when I did the preliminary interview, he didn't give me that information.
Right.
When he went through his other stages of interviews, that same question was asked and he still did not give the information. So he had ample opportunity along the line.
And then it was later that you found out the truth?
Later, after being slightly under a month with us. And then we had to call him in, have a discussion with him and said, based on the fact, because he lied, we cannot continue with him being an employee in the organization.
Yeah.
And therefore, unfortunately, we're going to have to dismiss him immediately.
Okay.
And then we didn't go through disciplinary or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't want to go that route with him.
Sure.
We sort of left a record for him with a company. He was dismissed because of disciplinary procedure. Just sat down, gave him advice, told him to be honest in your application. And it's up to the person looking at your application then to make a judgment call whether they want to continue with your application or not.
Yeah.
But the moment you lie, you've broken that trust.
Sure.
So that person was released during probation. Extreme case, but it happened.
You mentioned probation being up to 2 years. What about companies where they actually contractually say your probation period is 6 months, and then if you pass your probation of 6 months, then you are considered as an employee?
Yeah. That probation actually really means nothing. You are actually under a 24-month probation.
Okay.
So that 3 months or 6 months probation is with the company to see whether, yes, they want to continue with your service and being able to deliver the outputs that you can deliver and say, yes, you are an employee of the organization.
Sure.
But within the employment law, they can still let you go
within the 2 years.
Within the 2 years.
Okay.
And a lot of people are not aware of that I'm not here to scare people off, but I think it's important that you as an employee know what your rights are. Also know that, you know, if an employer lets you go and they don't really give you the reason why, and they just say it's not working out, because I've heard of cases where that's been told,
Sure.
then it's because you're still within that 2 years, and so therefore they know they can let you go, but you don't really have, let's term it, employment rights. As I said, there's a couple of instances where they cannot do that, and one where it can be shown you're being discriminated against.
Yep.
And the other one would be whistleblowing.
Sure.
And there's a couple of other instances as well, but again, I will refer you to the ACAS website, which then details it out for you completely.
I wonder if employers are also aware of that 24-month period of probation.
Some of them are and some of them are not.
Okay, so it's equally important
It's
for employers
exactly.
to be aware.
And that's why I said earlier on, no, mostly employees don't know this, but I find that there are some employers who are not aware of it as well.
Yeah. And the grievance process itself, is that something that's always triggered by an employee being disgruntled and actually starting the grievance process? Or would there be an instance where the employer triggers a grievance process against an employee? Or is it just one way?
No, so the grievance process would be triggered by an employee.
Okay.
A disciplinary process would be triggered by the
An employer.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the difference between the two.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about the disciplinary side of things then. So we were talking earlier, you were saying that in certain instances the employer could put the employee on suspension.
Yeah.
So what would they have to do for that? How does that all work?
Alison, I've made quite a few notes on this. I'm going to be referring to notes as well with regard to that. So I think what's important when we talk about a suspension, both employee and employer should be aware of this.
Okay.
It comes back to the saying of innocent until proven guilty. So you're being placed on suspension because it could have been a serious allegation, which could be termed as a gross misconduct in the company. It could also be that it would be viewed that you would be tampering with evidence, or that you could be influencing witnesses that will have to be interviewed.
Sure.
So not all not all investigations would lead to suspension.
Right.
You'd have to look at the matter of the case and then decide. And as I said, sometimes it would be based on if it's a gross misconduct, then yes, we would place you on suspension. Or if we feel that you could tamper with evidence, or that you could influence witnesses, or even intimidate witnesses.
Sure.
From that perspective. So with a suspension, you would be placed on paid suspension.
Okay.
So they have to pay you for that specific period of time. And they have to also tell you for how long the suspension will be.
Okay.
Now, it cannot be a suspension that's going to run along forever, because this is something that needs to be resolved as soon as possible so that everybody has closure to the outcome.
Of course.
And especially with the person who's being suspended, they also need to know, is this going to progress to a disciplinary hearing?
Sure.
And then what's the outcome of that disciplinary hearing going to be?
Okay.
So and also to know, if I am innocent and I'm being placed on suspension, I want my name cleared.
Sure.
And the investigation might be able to show that, from the evidence that they've gathered, there isn't a basis to go through to disciplinary hearing. From that perspective. So that's quite important to look at it from that perspective. With the suspension, so a lot of people say, but how can I tamper with evidence? I can give you another example of a client that I worked for. So if you are someone that get confidential information sent to you via email,
Mm-hmm.
and you use that information to send it to your personal email,
Mm-hmm.
then you are actually transgressing the rules of the company, because that email at the bottom in most cases would say this is belongs to the company and this is confidential, please do not share with
Yeah.
anyone else.
Okay.
The moment you are sending it outside of the company firewall,
Mm-hmm.
you are sharing that information, because I don't know if you sent it to yourself, with whom are you going to share that information,
Okay.
from that perspective. So it could be that we find out that you've been sending that information, and we decided we're going to suspend you immediately,
Yeah.
and then ask you to leave the company ASAP,
Mm-hmm.
because we're scared you're going to tamper with the evidence in wanting to delete
Yeah.
the emails, etc. Obviously, IT has a way to find out if those emails have been deleted and whether
Mhm.
you've sent it. But that would be a reason in terms of that's why we're placing you on suspension, because you're going to be tampering with evidence.
Okay.
Also, if it's felt that you know there are witnesses that saw you do something
Mm-hmm.
and you want to intimidate them,
Sure.
then it's best that you're placed on suspension.
Okay.
If it's a transgression that's not considered to be too serious,
Mm-hmm.
let's take the one in terms of the banter
Okay.
of earlier on. All that we can do is look at in terms of, could I place you in another department where you can do the work still, but still be within the company?
Sure.
Yeah. So you're going to look at the level, and then you're going to make a decision in terms of, do I place the individual on suspension or not? If you are unsure from an employer perspective, again, speak to your HR person, or speak to an employment lawyer who will be able to advise you whether it makes sense to suspend somebody or not.
Mm-hmm.
In the suspension as well, as I said, always make sure that there's a timeline,
Okay.
and you try and do your investigation as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And always, quite important, keep the person updated,
Sure.
so that they know how you're progressing,
Yeah.
and more or less when it's coming to an end,
Okay.
and by when they can expect an outcome.
Yeah.
And once you've done your investigation
Mm-hmm.
and you've got your outcome, communicate that as soon as possible,
Sure.
so then they know, okay, this is the outcome, there was no weight to what was said, and so therefore I'm in the clear. Or, you know what, they found this and this and this, and so therefore there's going to be a disciplinary hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the person could still be on suspension
Yeah.
till the disciplinary hearing takes place.
Sure.
From that perspective.
Okay.
Obviously, if the outcome is that there's no evidence to show what
Yep.
was said,
Mm-hmm.
then let them return to work immediately,
Of course.
and then get on with what needs to get done.
Albeit that there might still be some tension within
Exactly.
the teams.
I was going to say, so there's that still.
Yeah.
And so from a manager perspective, you need to look at how you're going to be dealing with that and
Yeah.
managing that.
I suspect that's going to be a topic that we talk about on a later.
Yes, and I
FB
think
Live,
that'll be a topic
because that can be a
completely
topic on its own.
And
Yeah.
how do you manage that? Because again, information could be sensitive,
Yeah.
and especially from a GDPR perspective, there's some information you cannot share.
Yeah.
That you got out of the investigation.
Yeah.
Etc.
So we'll leave that for a different discussion, but also putting it into the context of, as a manager, how do you deal with tensions within the team and that
Exactly.
sort of thing. So look out for that one at a later date.
I think what's also quite important to note, as I mentioned, when you place an employee on suspension, you're telling them they're being suspended with pay. You're also telling them more or less the duration of the suspension.
Mm-hmm.
What's also important is that if somebody is suspended with pay, they need to know it doesn't mean I just can go sit at home and relax. Obviously, you're not going to be relaxing, you'll be
No, of
stressed
course.
out. But it means that you've got to be available
Sure.
as and when required.
Okay.
And you cannot say, no, I am not available.
Yeah.
it will come to a point where they will then have to make a decision: do we continue the process without you?
Yep.
So if you are suspended, it's in your best interest to make yourself available when the request is put out to you. And also make sure there's a point of contact for the person who is suspended, who
Sure.
they can contact as well.
Okay.
Because remember, innocent until proven guilty.
Absolutely.
So don't treat them already as if they're a guilty party.
Of course.
Your investigation while they're on suspension is to see whether there is evidence
Yep.
to take through to a disciplinary hearing from that perspective.
And of course, a lot of the information about, starting a grievance process, what would constitute a grievance, and they'll give examples. What would actually, what sort of behaviours would mean that the company might start disciplinary against you, how the suspension process works. All of that information should be in the HR policy or the
Exactly.
HR manual, shouldn't it?
It should. And this is what I tell all employers, especially smaller businesses. They think I'm small. I don't need this right now.
You absolutely do.
And it's the moment they have an issue, then it's, oh my goodness, how do we deal with this? You could have prevented it by being proactive. The moment you took on employee number one and putting an employee manual in place or employee handbook, it does not have to be this labor-intensive employee handbook. It's just certain areas in terms of what the employee needs to know. This is the process the company follows. And as I said, the ACAS website is there to refer to.
Yeah.
And when I draw up an employee handbook for a client, I'll always refer to the employee, to the ACAS website to make sure that it's in line with what is being prescribed by them. Because it would be things like, what's a disciplinary process? What's a grievance process? What steps should I follow in either of those instances? Secondly, it could also be things related to paternity, maternity.
Absolutely.
Your statutory sick pay. All of that goes into an employee handbook. Now, I've been busy with a disciplinary investigation quite recently.
Indeed.
Small organization, head count of circa, I would say 10 to 12 employees. And again, they thought they were a small organization and they did not need that at that moment in time. Unfortunately, things progressed to a state where they had to place an employee on suspension. I was then called in as an independent investigation officer. So I had to interview the employees, and sorry, I forgot to mention this. Quite important, in your investigation, you have to interview the person that's placed on suspension as well.
Of course.
So it's not only the feedback that you're getting from the people you're interviewing, but you're also getting feedback from the person that's been placed on suspension, because you've got to look at all the information before you make a decision. And unfortunately, in this case, there was enough evidence to show that they had to progress to disciplinary hearing. But in my outcome, I had to also show that if an employee handbook was in place and people knew what the process was to follow, they could have referred to the employee handbook, and a lot of the issues raised in terms of allegations could have been dealt with at that moment in time. Some of them were grievances, some of them were related to not following reasonable instructions, and then some of them had to do with in terms of how fellow colleagues were being treated. So in that instance, if employees knew who they could go to, because what came out in the investigation interview was they told me we didn't know who to go to.
Right.
We didn't know how to raise this, and so we also just left it. And also with the individual being a senior within the organization, they felt uncomfortable in raising it. So the employee handbook, I would say, is the Bible of the company, if I can use that word.
Yeah. But it also has to be somewhere that people can find it as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. I noticed that we've got a question online as well. The question is, how does an employee deal with constant reorganisation and the stress of not knowing their role in the workplace? That's a really good question.
That is a good question. So reorganisation, I'm going to assume you're referring to restructuring.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is what's happening throughout all organisations right now. It just feels like some organisations, every year they go through a reorganisation. Now, what makes it difficult is that it doesn't fall within a disciplinary or a grievance process.
Yeah.
The company needs to show the reason why they are going through a reorganizational structure.
Mm-hmm.
What's a business case for doing that? But similar, I think the stresses that people go through are similar in terms of, am I going to lose my job? And where does that leave me? And I think it comes back to what you mentioned earlier on in terms of the employee well-being. What are the avenues available to you that you can go and speak to people and get advice from that perspective? What I've got to note though is that if you're going through the reorganization and there is no consultation process, then yes, that would be almost a grievance that you put in to say, I've not been consulted, but related to the restructuring what's happening within the organization.
And of course, it's really important to have strong disciplinary in place as well. I'm thinking back to years ago when I worked in a large corporate and we were reorganising. One of the employees was disgruntled about being made redundant, and he was working in the IT department, and he actually did something that brought the whole IT network down and caused problems for well over a week. So it was really important in that instance that the company had really clear disciplinary procedures.
Definitely, because that's gross misconduct.
Absolutely.
And in that case, they would suspend him.
Yeah.
And go through the process that I mentioned to you, do the investigation, then a disciplinary, and then at the outcome of the disciplinary decide whether he should be fired or not, or whether it's a written warning. But you would look, in most cases, gross misconduct would lead to somebody being fired from the organisation. Something which I forgot to mention, which is a good guideline, not only for yourself as an employer, but for the employee as well. In the employee handbook, you can give examples of what would constitute as being a gross misconduct, a serious offence or a less serious offence, and where verbal warnings, written warnings, etc. would be given. Again, it's only a guideline. Nobody can go and say, oh, but your employment manual is saying that, so therefore you've got to follow that. It's a guideline. And that list that you're giving as an example, you could also just put a caveat to say other issues would be added to this, as and when required. Yeah,
because you can't think of, you try your best to think of things, but you can't always think of everything. And that just reiterates how important it is to have those procedures in place.
Yes.
I'm even thinking of, I mean, even if you're a really small business, just say there's two friends that start up a business together.
Yes.
Even just having these sorts of things in place helps. If the relationship breaks down, if somebody, as you say, wants to go on maternity leave, if things happen that you didn't plan for, if you've got these things in place and you've got your independent HR person that you can go to, it helps when things don't quite go as planned, which in more cases than you realise, things don't quite go as planned between partnerships and companies that started up by two friends or husband and wives or whatever. You know, things can fall apart quite quickly.
I think we need to be practical and we have to be realistic.
Yep.
Emotions get in the way. No matter if we tell ourselves, oh, we're not going to do that to each other. protect yourself and protect the other person. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
And yes, it's not nice to have all these legalities in place, but you will appreciate it when something happens
When you need it.
and there's a process in place. I think what people tend to forget is there's this whole thinking of it's not going to happen to me.
Yeah.
And it can happen to anyone. And I think more importantly, we don't want cases to go to tribunals.
No.
And when it does go to tribunal, they look at, has the process been followed?
Yep.
And they would look at also in terms of what you have within the organization to show that you followed a process.
Indeed.
Was the person aware of that process? Was it a fair process? And I've got to stress the word fair.
Fair. Yeah.
So all of this helps you to show that you've got a stronger case. And especially, like you said, Alison, if it's a husband and wife, if even brother and sister,
Yeah, of course.
or sisters, or partners,
Friends,
or friends, whatever. Ultimately, at the end of the day, just cover yourself.
Absolutely.
And actually all parties, not only yourself, you're looking after the interest of everyone within the organization. Ultimately, it's a business at the end of the day, and there's a reason why you went into that business. So from that perspective, I would say it's good to have something in place. And I will stress again, if you're a small business, we're not saying put this hefty document in place that I can throw you dead with. Like, your major corporate organizations have. You don't need to have a specific policy and process for everything. It could be summarized in your employment manual or your employee handbook.
Yep.
And you can just refer back to it. That's all that you need. And in a place, as you said, where people have access to it.
Yep.
So you've got an intranet site, that's an ideal place to place it on. Also, it's available in the HR function.
Yeah.
But I would say good practice would be when somebody starts within a company, when they're on board, give them a copy of it, whether it's soft copy or hard copy.
Yeah.
And always say this document will be updated as and when need be, and they can always get an updated document, either from yourself as the line manager or owner of the company, or from the HR person.
So you've got all those policies and processes in place, and we've talked about when an employee might start the whole grievance process. How does as an employer do we know when to start the disciplinary process?
I think for an employer it is actually a little bit easier, because as I mentioned, you would have a list of transgressions.
Okay.
And you would know also in terms of when this process needs to start.
Sure.
Now, again, depending on the transgression, I sit down with line managers and I advise, and I will tell them, maybe we should just first have an informal discussion with the employee. Example, for ever coming late to work.
Sure.
Let's sit down with the employee, understand the reason why they're coming late to work. Let them understand this is what the employment contract says, and if it does continue, we're then going to have to start the formal process. If that does continue, you did have the informal discussion, and you can refer back to the discussion we had whenever. Things have not improved, so therefore I'm going to have to start the formal process.
Sure.
So depending on what the transgression is, you could possibly first go to a verbal warning, a written warning,
of course.
and then obviously to a disciplinary, and the disciplinary could say final written warning, or it could be that you get fired from the organization. Again, as it's similar to the grievance, depending on the transgression, first sit down and see if we can resolve it. But again, with that individual where you said, I'm trying to think of the word that you used now, but in terms of the IT systems, obviously you're not going to sit down and have a discussion, an informal discussion about that.
No.
That's a serious gross misconduct.
Yeah.
So obviously you will follow the serious steps with regard to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And of course we're not necessarily expecting every single line manager to know how to carry out a disciplinary process, we're expecting them to go to their HR person.
Yes.
If it gets to the point where they need to, they will also go to employment lawyers. Large companies will have those internally. Smaller companies will go to an external employment lawyer in the same way that an employee will. So it's not that you need to know all this stuff personally.
No.
You just need to know what your part of the process is and where to go for the next steps is the most important thing.
And also, if you feel you want to get some training in either aspect of it, again, if you go to the ACAS website, they provide you with information regarding training.
Yeah.
And you can look at whether you can do the training via them, or there are other institutions that you can do the training through as well. There's plenty of companies that offer HR for non-HR managers.
Yeah.
And this would be part of that process.
Is it ACAS that also has some online learning that you can do?
Yes. So they've got a lot of YouTube videos,
yeah,
which is a good resource to go back to.
Mm-hmm.
Myself being an HR professional, I have to keep up to date with what's happening out there. Me, myself, is not going to remember all the detail. And so that's why I also refer back to ACAS.
Of course.
I just find it's a good source. It's up to date. The information is there. And again, I've got my network of employment lawyers that I go to as well.
So I have one last question for you before we close. What about if you're a contractor and you're contracted to a company? Does any of this apply?
No, it does not. Because it cannot be treated as an employee.
Okay.
I think in 2 weeks' time or 3 weeks' time, I can't remember exactly, we're going to be talking about the role of a contractor.
Okay.
And we should be able to get more information from the person that we will be speaking to, who is an employment lawyer. And he will be able to give us more detail with regard to that.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Well, I think that's all we've got time for.
Yes.
Thank you very much, everybody. That's everything for today, and we look forward to talking with you again next week. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your questions. Goodbye.
Goodbye, and I hope it does not become a minefield for you. But as I said, we are available, but similarly, we can refer you to people who could help you with the process. Enjoy the rest of your day and your week until we speak again next week. Bye.